Okay, so today we will discuss about the acid properties. Now, first of all, before moving on to the acid properties, what is a transaction? A transaction can be defined as a single logical unit of work that accesses and possibly modifies the contents of database. Now, accessing of the database and modifying the contents of the database is known as the transactions. We are doing different kind of transactions by using the SQL statements. Now, transactions accesses data during read and write operations. Now, so that the consistency of the database is maintained before and after the transaction has been completed. Now, there are certain properties that are to be followed. Now, to check for those that whether the consistency is maintained during, before, as well as after transactions, we need to check the consistency by using certain properties, and these properties are known by the term of acid properties. Now, what are these properties? We will discuss one by one. The first property is acid. That means first A stands for atomicity, C stands for consistency, I stands for isolation, whereas D stands for durability. If we just define each of the terms, that atomicity defines that the entire transaction takes place at once or does not happen at all, whereas the consistency defines that the database must be consistent before and after the transactions. Isolation defines that the multiple transactions occur independently without any interference. Durability defines that the changes of the successful transition occurs even after the system failure occurs. Now we will understand each of these terms in detail. First of all, we will come to the atomicity. It defines that the entire transaction takes place at once or it does not happen at all. That means there is no midway in between the two transactions. Either the transaction is happening completely, complete transaction is occurring, or the transaction is a failure one, or it does not happen. Each of the transaction is considered to be a single unit, and that either runs to completion or is not executed. That means for a transaction, in order to follow the atomicity rule, there are only two operations: abort, that is changes made in the database is not visible, and commit, changes made in the database is visible. It is also referred to as all for nothing rule. If we just try to understand atomicity with a real life example, let us consider that there are two persons X and Y. Both are having, X is having 500 in his account and Y is having 200 in his account. We are doing a transaction. Suppose we are transferring the money, and there we are transferring a sum of 100 rupees from X to Y. That means the balance of X will be decremented by 100, whereas the balance of Y will be incremented with 100. Now, after the transaction is completed, that is X, the current amount of X will be decremented with 100, whereas the current amount of Y will be incremented with 100, plus that means plus 100. After the write operation is completed, the amount, the transaction that has occurred successfully is being reflected to the database, and we see that after the transaction has occurred successfully, the account balance of X is 400, that is 100 is decremented or debited, whereas the amount of 100 has been credited for Y. That is, previously it was 200, now it is 300. The next property is the consistency, which refers to that integrity constants must be maintained so that the database is consistent before and after transaction. That means that it refers to the correctness of the database. That means total amount, the sum of amount between the two uh, two different persons should be maintained. That means the total amount of X and Y before the transaction has occurred and after the transaction has occurred, this should be the same or uniform. Therefore, in the that means if a debit of 200 has occurred, that means 500 plus 200, that is 700. Whereas if this was the amount before the transaction has occurred, total sum of money was 700, and after the transaction has occurred, T1 has decreased to 400 and T2 has increased to 300. Therefore, the sum of money is also 700. That means the total sum of money before and after transaction must be equal to, both must be equal, that is equal to 700 in the example that we have considered. Therefore, the database is consistent. Inconsistency occurs whenever this amount is not the same. That is T1 completeness but T2 fails. As a result, the entire T is incomplete. In those cases, the inconsistency is occurring. The third property is the isolation. The multiple transactions, when it is occurring concurrently, it will without leading to inconsistency of the database. That means transactions occur independently without any interference. And it also says that the changes occurring in a particular transaction will not be visible to any other transaction until and unless it is written into the memory or it has been committed. That means only after a particular, after the transaction is completed and the final value is written into the memory, then only the change in the database will be reflected. Execution of a transaction occurs concurrently will result to the state that is equivalent to the state achieved in the same order. If we consider again the same case, that is X value is 500 and Y value is 500, a transaction, suppose T has been executed till read AY, that means till the fourth particular statement, and then the T dash has started. That means the operation T is continuing when the T dash is started. Therefore, the value which the T dash will receive for X will be the correct one, whereas the value that it will receive for the Y will be incorrect. Why it will be incorrect? Because the transaction for Y has not yet been occurred when the T double dash has started. Therefore, it will receive an incorrect value of Y and it will get an incorrect sum. Therefore, how to improve this? That means T dash should be waiting till the both of the value of X and Y are written. Then only if T double dash has started, it can get the accurate value of X and Y. Now we come to the fourth property, that is durability, that which refers that once the transaction has completed successfully, the updates and modifications to the database are stored and they are written on the disk, and it will stay as even if there is a crash or the system failure. These updates will become permanent and will be stored in the non-volatile memory. The effects of the transactions thus are never lost. In case of there is a failure of the transaction or there is a system crash, that means it will not affect the value of the transaction that has occurred. And for this, the final value of the transactions must be written on the database. Therefore, that is all about the ACID properties. Thank you.